This wasn't just any old plane. This was a Douglas DC-3, a living fossil from the golden age of aviation, still flying through Canada's wild north. And on that cold summer evening in Hay River, the skies weren't kind. Thick clouds, swirling crosswinds, and a sudden rain squall rolling in fast. But Buffalo Airways, they were famous for flying through worse. Thanks to Ice Pilots NWT, everyone knew them as the airline that laughed in the face of the Arctic. But what happened on Flight 169 wasn't about the plane or the weather. It was about something way more human. Let's take a look. The command that changed everything. It all started just minutes after takeoff. Buffalo Airways Flight 169, a vintage Douglas DC-3 from the 1940s, was climbing out of Hay River, loaded with cargo for Yellowknife. The engines were roaring, the weather wasn't perfect, but manageable, and the crew was experienced. You'd think after flying these beasts for decades, a simple short haul would be routine, but it wasn't. At 1,000 feet, something happened. The left engine, that iconic Pratt & Whitney radial that had powered so many missions since the Second World War, started coughing. The co-pilot noticed the torque had dropped and the engine wasn't producing enough power. Seconds later, it failed completely. With one propeller windmilling in the air, the aircraft began losing speed. Now, the DC-3 is famous for being tough. It can fly on one engine, but it's not easy, especially with cargo on board and at low altitude. That's when the crucial moment came. The captain, dealing with the engine failure, gave a simple instruction: prep the gear. Now, here's where it gets messy. On the surface, that phrase doesn't sound like a big deal. But inside any cockpit, especially in a critical situation, words matter. They have to be clear and direct and leave no room for doubt. Prep the gear isn't in any checklist. It's not standard. And to the co-pilot, it sounded like, get ready to lower the landing gear. And that's exactly what happened. The co-pilot reached for the gear lever and extended the wheels. Here's the thing. Extending the landing gear on a DC-3 uses up precious hydraulic pressure. And worse, it creates massive drag. Imagine trying to ride a bike uphill with the brakes half on. That's basically what they did to the aircraft, with one dead engine and the other struggling to keep them airborne, dropping the gear that early sealed their fate. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada later confirmed this. They discovered that after the left engine failed, the hydraulic pressure gauge showed the system at 400 psi, which is standard. However, what the crew didn't realize was that the DC-3 doesn't have an accumulator, a backup system that holds pressure even when the engine stops powering the hydraulics. This meant that with the left engine dead, once that initial pressure was used, it wouldn't come back, and the gear would either jam halfway or make any further maneuvers near impossible. In any proper DC-3 emergency, standard procedure is simple: stabilize the aircraft first, clean it up, retract the gear, secure the failed engine, and then decide whether to continue or turn back. The gear stays up until you absolutely have to put it down. It's the basic drill every multi-engine pilot learns: climb, clean, secure. But because of that unclear command, the crew skipped a critical step. They added drag at the worst possible time. The hydraulic pressure dropped below 200 psi. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. The aircraft wasn't climbing anymore. It was sinking. The captain, realizing they couldn't maintain altitude, made the call for an emergency landing back at Hay River. But now, with no hydraulic pressure, they couldn't lower the flaps, which are essential for a soft landing. They had to circle back with a wounded aircraft, one engine out, flaps unavailable, and minimal control over their descent speed. It gets even more frustrating when you realize this whole event could have been avoided with just clearer communication. Instead of prep the gear, a clearer command like prepare to land, but don't lower the gear until I call for it, would have likely avoided the premature gear extension. In high-stress moments, ambiguous words become traps. Pilots rely on set phrases for a reason, because clarity can mean survival. Think about it like this. Have you ever been in a moment where someone's vague instructions led to a disaster? Maybe in a workplace, or even just driving with a friend who says, "Turn here," but doesn't mean the next intersection. That split-second confusion can snowball into disaster. And for Flight 169, that's exactly what happened. The DC-3, that warbird that had survived decades of service, ended up forced into a dangerous landing because of 3 unclear words: prep the gear. It also raises a deeper question about how flight culture can shape crew decisions, because this wasn't the first time Buffalo Airways had an incident linked to human error. So why would experienced pilots, ones who had handled countless emergencies, make such a simple, costly mistake? Culture under pressure. Before we dive into why Flight 169 spiraled into trouble, we need to talk about something bigger than just engine failures or bad weather. We need to talk about the culture behind Buffalo Airways. Because Buffalo wasn't just another cargo airline tucked away in the Canadian North. No, it was a full-blown reality TV sensation. The star of Ice Pilots NWT, with millions tuning in from all over the world, hooked by the romance of old-school flying. And at the heart of it all was Buffalo Joe McBrien, the founder and the face of this flying circus. He didn't just run an airline, he built a culture, one where the goal was simple: get the job done, no matter what it takes. Fly through storms, keep ancient aircraft alive, and push through where other airlines wouldn't even try. Joe's philosophy was crystal clear: if the plane can fly, it goes. And this wasn't hidden in some company memo, it was proudly broadcast to the world. Now on TV, it made for some amazing drama. Watching pilots fight ice storms, repair 70-year-old aircraft on the fly, and land on frozen rivers, it was addictive. And it was true to some extent. Northern aviation is raw, unpredictable, and sometimes brutal. The TV show showed the grit, the last-minute saves, and the pilots pulling off miracles. But here's where it gets interesting. The cameras never really showed the quieter, more serious side of aviation. Things like regulations, safety protocols, and why procedures exist in the first place. And that's where the cracks started showing. Because inside Buffalo Airways, the culture didn't always align with the rulebook. Transport Canada, which oversees aviation safety in Canada, had been watching Buffalo closely for years, and they didn't like what they saw: repeated infractions, sloppy maintenance practices, and what regulators called a willful non-compliance attitude. In 2015, things finally boiled over. Transport Canada took the unprecedented step of suspending Buffalo Airways' operating certificate. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. For an airline to get grounded like that, it means regulators found fundamental issues, not just one-off mistakes. Reports pointed to serious gaps in their safety management system, things like incomplete maintenance records, poor oversight, and pilots operating without proper training updates. Even more concerning, investigations revealed there was an adversarial relationship between Buffalo's leadership and regulators. Basically, when Transport Canada raised issues, Buffalo pushed back instead of fixing them. And this wasn't just bureaucracy flexing its muscles. Previous incidents had already exposed the risks of this get-it-done culture. There was the 2013 forced landing after an engine failure, where poor crew communication played a major role. The TSB's report from that crash also pointed out gaps in training and procedures. Sound familiar? And that's what brings us back to Flight 169. Because when you step into a cockpit where the culture says, just keep flying, it starts to affect how decisions are made. You see, organizational culture doesn't just stay in the office. It follows you into the air. It shapes how pilots respond under pressure, whether they follow standard procedures or cut corners, and whether they speak up or stay silent. That phrase, prep the gear, didn't come out of nowhere. It was born inside a culture where improvisation was normal, where old habits blended with a relaxed approach to safety, a culture where checklist discipline was often overruled by get-it-done instincts. In a highly procedural environment, vague commands would have been corrected, but in Buffalo's world, where flexibility was seen as a strength, it slipped through the cracks. And this isn't just about blaming pilots. It's about understanding how people behave when the system around them rewards results over process. You can have the best training manual in the world, but if your daily reality tells you to cut corners to stay on schedule, mistakes aren't just possible, they're inevitable. Buffalo's track record makes this painfully clear. By the time Flight 169 went down, the airline had built a long history of tension with regulators, accidents tied to human error, and resistance to structured oversight. The TSB even said in its reports that Buffalo's reactive safety system relied more on fixing problems after they happened rather than preventing them in the first place. And this reactive mindset bled into cockpit decision-making. Now, you might be thinking, well, they flew in extreme conditions. They kept the North supplied, so maybe some rule bending was necessary. But here's where the debate heats up. What's more important, getting the job done or following procedures to the letter? That tension between raw northern survival and structured aviation safety was always at the center of Buffalo Airways. And for Flight 169, that tension played out in real time. What do you think? Is it better to push through to deliver, even if it means bending some rules? Or should safety always come first, no matter the cost? A history, written in belly landings. Before we break down those final chaotic moments inside Flight 169's cockpit, there's something you need to understand. Buffalo Airways had seen belly landings before, just not like this. And ironically, their own history with gear-up landings might have made the crew's decisions even more dangerous that day. Let's go back to 2015. Buffalo's Curtiss C-46 Commando, a beast of a cargo hauler from the World War II era, took off on a routine trip to DeLine. Mid-flight, things went south. The crew lost hydraulic pressure, meaning they couldn't get the landing gear down. But here's where the experience kicked in. They didn't panic. They didn't make rushed decisions. They followed a classic last resort strategy: keep the gear up and land on the aircraft's belly. And it worked. The pilots kept the gear stowed, managed the descent, and slid the plane safely onto the runway with zero injuries. The C-46 was damaged, sure, but everyone walked away. The TSB report praised the crew for controlling the situation. It was a textbook example of how experience and calm decision-making can save lives, even in impossible situations. Now, fast forward to Flight 169. One engine was dead, hydraulic pressure was about to drop, and the crew faced another emergency landing. But this time, something flipped. Instead of holding off on the gear, they dropped it too early, making the aircraft even harder to control. The same airline that had safely belly-landed a C-46 was now trapped by the landing gear on a DC-3. And the cruel irony? The very familiarity with belly landings may have influenced their thinking. They knew gear-up landings could be done, but only in specific situations. Flight 169's crew wasn't planning for it, but in the back of their minds, that option always existed. But this story gets even more layered when you zoom out. Because Buffalo Airways doesn't just have one or two incidents on the books, its safety history reads like a roller coaster. The C-46 at DeLine wasn't an isolated event. There was a DC-3 engine fire in 2013 during climb-out from Yellowknife, forcing a shutdown and return. Before that, there were forced landings, mechanical breakdowns, and more than one incident of landing without full control of the aircraft. According to reports from Skybrary and aviation trackers, Buffalo had stacked up multiple runway excursions, emergency returns, and mechanical failures over the years. Transport Canada flagged these patterns, calling out the airline's safety management system for being reactive rather than proactive. They didn't fix problems before they happened. They just dealt with them after something broke. This wasn't theory. This was written into their regulatory history. And here's why this matters for Flight 169. When you fly for an airline with a long list of mechanical scares, you build up a kind of resilience, but it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, you get good at handling emergencies. You stay calm under pressure. But on the other hand, you can get too comfortable with things going wrong. You stop seeing warning signs as threats and start seeing them as routine hurdles to muscle through. That's why Flight 169's crew made critical errors. They didn't panic, but they misread the situation. They didn't freeze up, but they acted too soon. They weren't scared. They were too comfortable. And when you're too comfortable with things breaking, you can end up normalizing the very mistakes that take you down. Buffalo Airways' history shows us this tension in full color. The same culture that allowed them to safely land a powerless C-46 may have contributed to overconfidence in Flight 169. The same experience that helped save lives before might have pushed this crew toward a fatal miscalculation. But how does a seasoned crew, flying a plane they know inside out, go from calm confidence to catastrophe in minutes? What exactly happened in those final 20 minutes? 20 minutes to disaster. Alright, let's rewind the clock and step right into the cockpit of Buffalo Airways Flight 169. We've got 20 minutes to go from takeoff to disaster, and thanks to official reports, we can now piece together exactly how things spiraled out of control. The first few minutes of the flight, completely routine. The DC-3, tail number CGJKM, lifted off from Hay River just like it had done hundreds of times before. But just 4 minutes after takeoff, the crew noticed something troubling. The left engine was losing oil pressure, and on these classic DC-3s, that is always a red flag. By the 6-minute mark, the engine began to vibrate heavily. The crew followed standard procedures: throttle back, feather the propeller, and shut the engine down. And here's where things started to quietly go wrong, because now the hydraulic pressure gauge has dropped to 0, and that's the trap. On DC-3s, the hydraulic system is designed so that when the landing gear and flaps are fully retracted, the pressure naturally bleeds off and reads 0. This is normal. But in the heat of the moment, staring at a dead engine and a flatlined gauge, the first officer misinterpreted what he was seeing. At around 8 minutes in, the captain said 3 little words: "Prep the gear," a phrase that, in this moment, meant 2 different things to 2 people. To the captain, it meant checking the system and preparing for a possible emergency approach later, but to the first officer, it sounded like a direct command to lower the landing gear immediately. And that's exactly what happened. The first officer extended the gear at a low altitude, without enough time to build back airspeed. The already struggling DC-3 lost even more lift, and drag increased massively. The final minutes became a desperate fight to stay airborne. From minute 10 to minute 15, the captain and first officer battled to stabilize the aircraft, but the numbers were against them. The low speed, the gear hanging down, and the loss of one engine pushed the DC-3 to its limits. They couldn't make it back to Hay River. At minute 18, the captain made a critical call: ditch the return, turn right, and look for the best spot to belly land. With no gear left to retract and one engine out, they were committed. By minute 20, they touched down in a snowy field, using classic tail dragger technique to keep the nose high and minimize damage. The touchdown was rough but controlled, and somehow everyone survived. Looking back, the investigators were clear. The hydraulic pressure gauge wasn't broken. It was doing exactly what it was supposed to. But that misinterpretation, triggered by vague cockpit language and high-stress decision-making, set off a chain reaction that doomed the flight. Now we want to hear from you. What would you have done in that moment? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is a situation where experience and instinct can collide in dangerous ways. When old planes meet old habits. Buffalo Airways Flight 169 didn't end in tragedy, but it did end in wreckage. And when the investigation wrapped up, it wasn't some freak mechanical failure or freakish weather that got the blame. It was human factors, miscommunication, culture, habits that had gone unchecked for years. See, the DC-3 is a tough old bird, but it flies with quirks. Every old-school pilot knows the hydraulic gauge drops to 0 after takeoff. It's just how the system works. But the crew that day? They didn't stop to challenge their assumptions. One simple phrase, "prep the gear," triggered a decision chain that the aircraft simply couldn't recover from. The investigation pointed straight at Buffalo Airways' cockpit culture. Transport Canada had already flagged them years earlier for not properly following safety management practices. They warned about adversarial attitudes to regulations, and Flight 169 proved that the mindset hadn't changed. But here's the thing, this wasn't about villains or heroes. These were experienced, skilled pilots. Pilots who had flown in harsh northern conditions, kept communities supplied, and kept vintage aircraft alive. Yet, the same confidence that made them capable also made them vulnerable. Even the most seasoned crews can make snap judgments under pressure. And when those judgments are shaped by culture, shortcuts, casual phrases, and old habits, the results can be catastrophic. The DC-3 survived almost 80 years in the air because it was built tough, but no plane is tougher than human error. CGJKM was written off, grounded forever. So, what do you think? Was this just an unavoidable accident or a culture waiting to crash? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and we'll see you in the next one.